The evening sun was setting over Pine Creek City as Officer Wilson slouched in his patrol car, drumming his fingers against the steering wheel. The day had been rough. A domestic disturbance call that went nowhere, 2 fender benders with uncooperative drivers, and endless paperwork. The steam from his third coffee of the shift rose in lazy swirls, doing little to improve his mood. He'd been on the force for 12 years, and lately every shift felt longer than the last. The neighborhood had changed, he thought to himself, not like the good old days. New faces, new attitudes, new problems. He didn't like change, never had. The radio crackled with routine chatter, a noise complaint across town, a shoplifter at the mall, nothing that required his attention. Wilson took another sip of his coffee, grimacing at the bitter taste. The small parking lot where he'd stationed himself gave him a clear view of the intersection, his usual spot for catching speeders and writing tickets. It was almost the end of his shift, and his quota for the month was still short. The sound hit him first, the distinctive wail of an ambulance siren cutting through the evening air. In his rearview mirror, he spotted the flashing lights approaching rapidly. The ambulance was moving fast, faster than he thought necessary. Something about it rubbed him the wrong way. This was his territory, his streets, and that ambulance was taking liberties. The paramedic behind the wheel was focused intently on the road, navigating through traffic with practiced precision. Inside the ambulance, his partner worked frantically to stabilize their patient, whose condition was deteriorating by the minute. But Officer Wilson saw none of this. All he saw was what he wanted to see. Another example of people not respecting his authority. Without a second thought, Wilson flicked on his cruiser's lights and pulled out to follow the ambulance. The move was smooth, practiced, something he'd done countless times before. But this time was different. This time, his actions would set in motion a chain of events that would change not just his life, but the lives of everyone involved. The ambulance continued its journey, weaving through traffic with urgency. Wilson's pursuit tightened, his cruiser closing the gap. In his mind, he was just doing his job, maintaining order. The fact that this was an emergency vehicle seemed to matter less and less as his irritation grew. The dispatcher's voice came through his radio again, but he barely registered it. His attention was fixed on the ambulance ahead, watching as it slowed for a red light at the upcoming intersection. Perfect timing, he thought. He'd show them they couldn't just tear through his streets like they owned them. Little did Officer Wilson know that inside that ambulance, a story much bigger than his wounded pride was unfolding. A story that would soon explode across headlines and social media, forcing an entire city to confront uncomfortable truths about power, prejudice, and the consequences of unchecked authority. Through the ambulance's rear windows, medical equipment bounced with each turn, while the paramedic team worked with precise, urgent movements. Their patient's life hung in the balance, each second crucial. But outside, Officer Wilson saw only what he chose to see, another chance to assert his control over his little corner of the world. As both vehicles approached the red light, Wilson's jaw clenched. He'd been passed over for promotion twice in the past year, and each slight, real or imagined, had built up like layers of rust on his once bright badge. This ambulance, these paramedics, they were just another example of people not giving him the respect he deserved. The traffic light cast a red glow over the scene as the ambulance eased to a stop, its siren still wailing. Wilson pulled up close behind, his cruiser's lights painting the street in alternating flashes of blue and red. His hand moved to open his door, mind already made up about what would happen next. In that moment, as Officer Wilson stepped out of his patrol car, he had no idea that his next actions would not only shatter lives, but would force an entire department to face its demons. The dash cam on his cruiser recorded silently, its unblinking eye about to capture a moment that would soon be played and replayed across every news channel in the country. The air was thick with tension as Wilson approached the ambulance, his boots heavy on the asphalt. The night was about to take a turn that would leave no one unchanged, not the officers, not the paramedics, not the patient fighting for their life in the back of that ambulance, and certainly not Officer Wilson himself. The stage was set. The players were in position, and in the next few moments, everything would change. The red light cast long shadows across the intersection as Officer Wilson approached the ambulance, his hand resting on his belt. The paramedic behind the wheel could see him coming in the side mirror, could read the tension in his stride. This wasn't the first time the paramedic had dealt with difficult situations, but something about the officer's approach set off warning bells. "Step out of the vehicle," Wilson barked, his voice carrying the weight of 12 years of accumulated frustrations. The paramedic took a deep breath, glancing back at his partner, who was still working frantically to stabilize their patient. They were only 7 minutes from the hospital, 7 crucial minutes that were now being wasted. The paramedic rolled down his window instead of getting out. "Sir, we have a critical patient on board," he explained calmly, his credentials clearly visible on his uniform. "Their condition is deteriorating. We need to get to County General immediately." His voice was steady, professional, despite the urgency of the situation. But Wilson wasn't listening, not really. All he heard was someone challenging his authority, someone else who didn't respect the badge. "I said step out," he repeated, his voice rising. "You were driving recklessly through my streets." Inside the ambulance, medical equipment beeped urgently. The patient's vitals were becoming unstable. The second paramedic called out from the back, "We're losing time. BP's dropping." The stress in their voice was clear, but Wilson seemed deaf to everything except his own anger. The lead paramedic tried again, his hands visible on the steering wheel. "Officer, please. I understand your concern, but this is a legitimate emergency. We're following all proper protocols for emergency transport. Here's my ID and our dispatch number." Wilson cut him off, his face reddening. "Don't tell me about protocols. I've been working these streets since before you were old enough to drive." The claim was probably false, but Wilson believed it in that moment. He believed a lot of things that weren't quite true anymore. Traffic had begun to build up behind them. A few drivers had their phones out, recording the scene. The ambulance siren was still wailing, its lights painting everyone in alternating red and white. The second paramedic appeared at the back window, medical gloves still on, trying to convey the gravity of their situation. "Officer," they called out, "our patient is critical. We can file any reports you need at the hospital, but right now, minutes count. Please." Wilson's reaction was immediate and explosive. "Get back inside. Don't think you can gang up on me." His hand tightened on his belt, his stance becoming more aggressive. The paramedics exchanged glances. They'd been trained for difficult situations, but this was escalating beyond anything in the manual. The lead paramedic made a decision. Lives were at stake, and protocol was clear. The patient came first. "Sir, I'm going to continue to the hospital. You can follow us if you need to, but we cannot delay any longer." He put his hand on the gear shift, preparing to move. That's when everything went sideways. Wilson's face contorted with rage. In his mind, this was the last straw. Another person disrespecting his authority, another challenge to his power. He reached for the door handle, yanking it open with enough force to shake the entire ambulance. "You don't move unless I say you move," Wilson shouted, grabbing for the paramedic's arm. The paramedic instinctively pulled back, trying to protect himself while staying in his seat. It was the worst thing he could have done, though also the most human. Wilson saw the movement as resistance. In his anger-clouded mind, the simple defensive gesture became an attack. His training, his experience, his better judgment, all of it disappeared in a red haze of fury. His arm drew back, and before anyone could react, he struck. The impact was loud in the suddenly quiet street. Even the ambulance siren seemed to fade for a moment. The paramedic's head snapped to the side, his safety belt the only thing keeping him in his seat. Time seemed to freeze, the moment crystallizing into something that would play over and over in everyone's memories. But the universe wasn't done with Officer Wilson yet, because at that exact moment, at the precise second his fist connected with the paramedic's face, the back doors of the ambulance swung open wide. And what Wilson saw inside would change everything. The world seemed to hold its breath. The red light above them turned green, but nobody moved. The only sound was the continuing wail of the ambulance siren and the steady, increasingly urgent beep of medical equipment. Officer Wilson stood frozen, his fists still clenched, as the truth of what he'd just done, and who he'd done it in front of, began to sink in. The next few seconds would feel like an eternity to everyone involved. But they would be seconds that would reshape lives, careers, and an entire department's approach to power and responsibility. Because sometimes the biggest changes come from the smallest moments, Moments like this one, frozen in the red and white lights of an ambulance on an otherwise ordinary evening. Time seemed to stop as the ambulance's back doors swung wide open. Officer Wilson stood there, his fists still clenched, as his eyes adjusted to the scene inside. The steady beeping of medical equipment filled the air, but it was the patient's face that made his blood run cold. There, lying on the stretcher, was Mrs. Richardson, the chief of police's wife. The second paramedic was hovering over her, hands steady despite the chaos, focused entirely on keeping her alive. The medical equipment told a scary story, dropping blood pressure, irregular heartbeat, every second critical. Mrs. Richardson's face was pale, oxygen mask fogging with each labored breath, her usually perfectly styled silver hair spread across the pillow. Wilson's arm dropped to his side like it was made of lead. He knew Mrs. Richardson from department picnics, from charity events, from all those times she'd brought homemade cookies to the precinct. She was the woman who remembered every officer's birthday, who organized care packages for rookies, who'd helped plan his own daughter's baby shower last year. The second paramedic didn't even look up from their work. BP's still dropping, they called out, voice tense but professional, "We need to move, now." Their hands never stopped moving, adjusting IV lines, checking vitals, fighting to keep Mrs. Richardson stable. Officer Wilson stumbled backward, his boots suddenly unsteady on the pavement. Through the windshield, he could see other cars stopping, more phones recording. Someone in the growing crowd shouted something, but the words didn't register. All he could focus on was the horrible reality of what he'd just done. The lead paramedic was already turning back to the steering wheel, his lips split where Wilson's fist had connected. There was no anger in his movement, no desire for revenge or retaliation. His only concern was his patient. "Officer," he said quietly, "please let us do our job." Those simple words hit harder than any punch could have. Wilson felt sick. How many times had he said those exact same words to people who got in his way? How many times had he demanded that others respect his work, while he'd just assaulted someone for trying to do theirs? The distant wail of more sirens cut through his thoughts. Other officers were responding to the scene, of course they were. Standard procedure when an emergency vehicle was stopped. Wilson's dash cam had been recording everything. Everything. His career flashed before his eyes, but somehow that seemed less important now. Inside the ambulance, Mrs. Richardson's monitors beeped more urgently. The second paramedic called out numbers that meant nothing to Wilson, but clearly meant everything to them. The lead paramedic's hands were back on the wheel, ready to go the instant the path was clear. Wilson backed away from the ambulance door. His hands were shaking now, the adrenaline leaving his system, replaced by a cold, creeping horror. He'd just assaulted a paramedic. He'd just delayed an emergency transport. He'd just put the chief's wife's life at risk. All because what? Because he'd felt disrespected. Because he'd had a bad day. The first backup unit pulled up, lights flashing. Wilson could see it was Officer Rodriguez, a good cop, a friend. But right now, Rodriguez's face showed no friendship, only shock and disappointment as he took in the scene. More units were arriving, creating a circle of flashing lights that felt like a spotlight on Wilson's shame. Through the ambulance's still open back doors, Mrs. Richardson's monitor sounded another warning. The second paramedic's voice carried clearly, "We're losing her. We have to move." The lead paramedic didn't wait any longer. The ambulance's engine roared as he pulled away, leaving Wilson standing in a swirl of red and blue lights. Rodriguez approached slowly, hand on his belt. The look in his eyes said everything. He'd seen enough from across the intersection to know what had happened. Other officers were securing the scene, some talking to witnesses, others already on their radios. Wilson knew they were calling him in. The chief would be at the hospital soon, expecting to find his wife being treated, not knowing she'd been delayed. Not knowing why. Not yet. But he would know, Wilson realized. Everyone would know. Because in his blind anger, in his moment of prideful fury, he'd managed to do what no amount of training or warnings ever could. He'd shown exactly who he was and what unchecked power could do to a person's soul. As Rodriguez reached for Wilson's badge, neither man spoke. There was nothing to say. The evening air was filled with radio chatter, witness conversations, and the distant fading wail of the ambulance siren. But for Officer Wilson, the loudest sound was the echo of his own actions, a thunder in his ears that would never quite fade away. The red light above the intersection turned green again, then yellow, then red. Traffic slowly resumed its normal flow. But nothing else would be normal again. Not for Wilson, not for the department, and not for anyone who witnessed what happened when authority lost its way and forgot its true purpose: to protect and serve. The emergency room entrance at County General was a flurry of activity as the ambulance finally arrived. Medical staff rushed out to meet it, their movements precise and practiced. The paramedics transferred Mrs. Richardson to the waiting team, rattling off vital signs and treatment details with professional efficiency, despite everything that had happened. The lead paramedic's face was beginning to swell where Officer Wilson had struck him, but he stayed focused on his patient until the ER team wheeled her through the double doors. Only then did he allow himself to lean against the ambulance, the adrenaline finally wearing off, replaced by the dull throb of what would soon be a nasty bruise. Back at the intersection, the scene had transformed into something out of a police procedural. Squad cars created a perimeter, their lights painting the surrounding buildings in alternating blue and red. Officer Rodriguez had already called for internal affairs, following protocol even though it meant reporting a friend. Witnesses were being interviewed, their cell phone videos collected as evidence. The truth of what happened would be impossible to hide. Officer Wilson sat in the back of a squad car, no longer wearing his badge or gun belt. His face was blank, still struggling to process how quickly everything had fallen apart. Through the window, he could see people pointing, talking, some shaking their heads. A few had signs of recognition on their faces. They knew him from his patrols, from community meetings, from all those years of being the face of law enforcement in this neighborhood. The radio crackled with updates about Mrs. Richardson's condition. She had made it to the hospital, but those precious minutes lost at the intersection might have consequences. Each update made Wilson sink lower in his seat. He'd known her for 15 years. She'd been there when his daughter was born, bringing food and offering to help with the baby so his wife could rest. At the hospital, Chief Richardson burst through the emergency room doors, his face a mask of worry. He'd been in a budget meeting when the call came. His wife had collapsed at their grandson's baseball game. Now, seeing the lead paramedic's injured face, seeing the looks on his officers' faces, he knew something had gone terribly wrong. What happened? He demanded, his voice carrying the weight of both personal concern and professional authority. The lead paramedic straightened up, professional to the core, and began to explain. With each word, the chief's expression shifted from worry to disbelief, and finally to a cold anger that few had ever seen. News vans were starting to arrive at both scenes, the hospital and the intersection. This was the kind of story that would spread like wildfire. Already, social media was buzzing with eyewitness accounts and video clips. The department's public information officer was on his way, but damage control would be nearly impossible. The truth was too raw, too clear, too damning. Officer Rodriguez approached the squad car where Wilson sat. They'd been partners once, years ago, when Wilson had been different. Before the bitterness, before the anger, before he'd started seeing threats instead of people. "Why'd you do it, man?" Rodriguez asked softly, not really expecting an answer. "What were you thinking?" Wilson just shook his head. The answer was both simple and complicated. He'd done it because he could. Because somewhere along the way, he'd forgotten that his badge was meant to be a shield for others, not a weapon for himself. Because he'd let power corrupt his judgment until he couldn't tell the difference between authority and abuse. At the hospital, Mrs. Richardson was being rushed into emergency surgery. The delay had indeed caused complications, though the skilled medical team was working tirelessly to stabilize her condition. The chief paced the waiting room, torn between being a worried husband and a department head facing a crisis. The lead paramedic sat in a treatment room, finally allowing a nurse to examine his injuries. His partner was filling out incident reports, their hands still shaking slightly from the stress of it all. They'd transported thousands of patients over the years, but this call would stay with them forever. Back at the scene, internal affairs investigators had arrived. They moved with purpose, collecting evidence, taking statements, photographing the intersection. Wilson watched through the squad car window as his career, his reputation, his whole life was documented and catalogued as evidence. The sun was setting now, casting long shadows across the city. In break rooms and living rooms across town, people were watching the news, sharing videos, discussing how someone sworn to protect and serve could do something like this. The incident was already becoming a symbol, a talking point, a catalyst for conversations that were long overdue. Officer Rodriguez made one final check of the scene before preparing to transport Wilson to the station. The intersection was almost cleared now, traffic slowly returning to normal. But nothing else would be normal, not for a long time. This evening had exposed something broken in the system, something that couldn't be fixed with just paperwork and procedures. As the squad car pulled away, Wilson caught a final glimpse of his reflection in the window. He barely recognized himself. Somewhere between the academy graduation and today, he'd lost his way. And now, in trying to prove his authority, he'd proven something else entirely. That power without compassion, without restraint, without humanity, was nothing but a danger to everyone it touched. The Internal Affairs Office hummed with activity even though it was well past midnight. Lieutenant Chen had been called in specially for this case, and she sat at her desk reviewing Officer Wilson's personnel file with growing concern. The file was thick, thicker than it should have been for someone still actively serving on the force. "You need to see this," she called to her partner, spreading out a series of complaint forms across her desk. The pattern was clear now that someone was finally looking for it. Over the past 5 years, there had been 17 complaints filed against Wilson. Excessive force, aggressive behavior, racial bias, all investigated, all dismissed, all buried under paperwork and excuses. The wall-mounted TV in the corner played news coverage of the incident on mute. Cell phone videos from multiple angles showed the confrontation in vivid detail. The lead paramedic's professional demeanor, Wilson's aggressive stance, the moment of impact, it was all there, impossible to deny or explain away. Down the hall, in interview room B, Wilson sat with his union representative. His uniform had been replaced with civilian clothes, his badge and gun turned in. The reality of his situation was finally starting to sink in. This wasn't going to be like those other complaints. This couldn't be swept under the rug or explained away with procedural justifications. "Tell me about your relationship with the emergency services in your patrol area," Lieutenant Chen asked, her voice neutral but firm. She'd been doing this job long enough to know how to get people talking. Wilson shifted in his chair, looking down at his hands. "I've always had issues with them speeding through my streets," he began, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded now. His streets. When had he started thinking of them as his streets instead of the community's streets? The investigation expanded beyond just that one incident. Lieutenant Chen's team pulled dispatch records, body camera footage, dash cam videos from months of patrols. They interviewed other officers, paramedics, firefighters. A picture began to emerge of an officer who had gradually lost touch with the true meaning of his badge. In another room, tech specialists were going through Wilson's work computer, his patrol car's computer, his radio logs. They found concerning search patterns, questionable comments in private messages to other officers, a trail of digital breadcrumbs that painted a disturbing picture of bias and growing hostility. The paramedic union representatives arrived with their own stack of documents. Previous incidents where Wilson had delayed emergency vehicles, demanded unnecessary credentials, created obstacles that could have cost precious minutes. None of these had resulted in formal complaints because emergency service workers often felt they couldn't spare the time to file reports or feed retaliation. Chief Richardson, balancing his personal crisis with his professional duties, authorized full access to all department records. His wife was stable now, but the doctors had been clear. The delay in treatment had caused complications that would require a longer recovery. The chief's face was grim as he signed the authorization forms. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. Lieutenant Chen's investigation revealed something else. Wilson wasn't alone. There were other officers with similar patterns, though none had escalated to this level yet. The system that had allowed Wilson to continue unchecked was itself part of the problem. Community members began coming forward with their own stories. A retired teacher recalled how Wilson had harassed her grandson for driving too nice a car for this neighborhood. A business owner shared security footage of Wilson being aggressive with customers he deemed suspicious. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. The Internal Affairs office hummed with activity even though it was well past midnight. Lieutenant Chen had been called in specially for this case, and she sat at her desk reviewing Officer Wilson's personnel file with growing concern. The file was thick, thicker than it should have been for someone still actively serving on the force. "You need to see this," she called to her partner, spreading out a series of complaint forms across her desk. The pattern was clear now that someone was finally looking for it. Over the past 5 years, there had been 17 complaints filed against Wilson. Excessive force, aggressive behavior, racial bias, all investigated, all dismissed, all buried under paperwork and excuses. The wall-mounted TV in the corner played news coverage of the incident on mute. Cell phone videos from multiple angles showed the confrontation in vivid detail. The lead paramedic's professional demeanor, Wilson's aggressive stance, the moment of impact, it was all there, impossible to deny or explain away. Down the hall, in interview room B, Wilson sat with his union representative. His uniform had been replaced with civilian clothes, his badge and gun turned in. The reality of his situation was finally starting to sink in. This wasn't going to be like those other complaints. This couldn't be swept under the rug or explained away with procedural justifications. "Tell me about your relationship with the emergency services in your patrol area," Lieutenant Chen asked, her voice neutral but firm. She'd been doing this job long enough to know how to get people talking. Wilson shifted in his chair, looking down at his hands. "I've always had issues with them speeding through my streets," he began, but even he could hear how hollow the words sounded now. His streets. When had he started thinking of them as his streets instead of the community's streets? The investigation expanded beyond just that one incident. Lieutenant Chen's team pulled dispatch records, body camera footage, dash cam videos from months of patrols. They interviewed other officers, paramedics, firefighters. A picture began to emerge of an officer who had gradually lost touch with the true meaning of his badge. In another room, tech specialists were going through Wilson's work computer, his patrol car's computer, his radio logs. They found concerning search patterns, questionable comments in private messages to other officers, a trail of digital breadcrumbs that painted a disturbing picture of bias and growing hostility. The paramedic union representatives arrived with their own stack of documents. Previous incidents where Wilson had delayed emergency vehicles, demanded unnecessary credentials, created obstacles that could have cost precious minutes. None of these had resulted in formal complaints because emergency service workers often felt they couldn't spare the time to file reports or feed retaliation. Chief Richardson, balancing his personal crisis with his professional duties, authorized full access to all department records. His wife was stable now, but the doctors had been clear. The delay in treatment had caused complications that would require a longer recovery. The chief's face was grim as he signed the authorization forms. This wasn't just about one incident anymore. Lieutenant Chen's investigation revealed something else. Wilson wasn't alone. There were other officers with similar patterns, though none had escalated to this level yet. The system that had allowed Wilson to continue unchecked was itself part of the problem. Community members began coming forward with their own stories. A retired teacher recalled how Wilson had harassed her grandson for driving too nice a car for this neighborhood. A business owner shared security footage of Wilson being aggressive with customers he deemed suspicious. Each story added another piece to the puzzle. The courthouse steps were crowded on the morning of Officer Wilson's hearing. News cameras lined the street, their lenses focused on the entrance. This wasn't just a local story anymore. It had become a national conversation about power, accountability, and the sometimes fragile relationship between law enforcement and emergency services. Inside, Wilson sat beside his attorney, looking smaller somehow in his civilian clothes. The past 3 months had aged him visibly. His hair had started graying at the temples, and deep lines had formed around his mouth. The weight of his actions showed in every slumped line of his shoulders. The lead paramedic sat on the opposite side of the courtroom. His split lip had healed weeks ago, but the incident had left other, less visible marks. He'd returned to work after just 2 days. Emergencies don't wait for wounds to heal, but something had changed. Other officers treated him differently now, some with newfound respect, others with barely hidden resentment. The district attorney presented the case methodically, laying out not just the events of that evening, but the pattern of behavior that led to it. Body camera footage played on screens around the courtroom. The images were crystal clear: Wilson's aggression, the paramedic's professionalism, the moment everything went wrong. This isn't just about one punch, the DA explained to the packed courtroom. This is about what happens when we fail to hold power accountable, when we look the other way, when we make excuses instead of changes. Mrs. Richardson testified from her wheelchair. She'd survived, but the delay in treatment had left her with complications that would take months of therapy to overcome. Her testimony was powerful in its simplicity. She described waking up in the hospital, learning what had happened, realizing that someone sworn to protect had instead put her life at risk. The chief sat behind his wife as she spoke, his face a mask of controlled emotion. He'd taken a leave of absence to help with her recovery, but also to focus on department reforms. This case had forced him to confront problems he should have seen years ago. Wilson's former partner, Officer Rodriguez, took the stand next. His testimony was difficult. Describing the changes he'd seen in his friend over the years, the warning signs everyone had ignored. "We're taught to have each other's backs," he said, his voice heavy. "But sometimes having someone's back means telling them they're wrong." The evidence was overwhelming. Lieutenant Chen's investigation had uncovered not just the immediate incident, but years of escalating behavior. Previous complaints that had been dismissed, warning signs that had been ignored, a system that had protected the wrong things for too long. During a break in proceedings, Wilson stood by a courthouse window, staring out at the city he'd once patrolled. He could see an ambulance racing past on the street below, lights flashing, and for the first time in years, he saw it for what it was: not a challenge to his authority, but fellow first responders trying to save lives. The lead paramedic's testimony was brief but impactful. He didn't speak about the assault itself, but about the countless times he'd had to take longer routes to avoid confrontation, the extra minutes added to emergency responses, the constant tension between doing his job and dealing with officer interference. "Every minute matters in our work," he explained, his voice steady. "When someone's having a heart attack, when there's a car accident, when a child can't breathe. Every second we're delayed could mean the difference between life and death." The defense tried to paint Wilson as a dedicated officer who'd had a bad day, but the evidence told a different story. This wasn't about one bad day. This was about power unchecked, about authority without accountability, about what happens when we forget that a badge is meant to protect, not to dominate. When the verdict came, it surprised no one. Guilty on all counts. Wilson would serve time, lose his pension, never work in law enforcement again. But as the judge read out the sentence, it was clear this case had become about more than just one officer's punishment. The judge's words echoed through the hushed courtroom. "The true measure of authority is not in how much power we have, but in how we use that power to serve others. When we forget that, when we put our pride above our duty, we betray not just our badge, but every person we've sworn to protect." Outside, protesters who had gathered daily since the incident began packing up their signs. Some had demanded justice, others called for broader reforms. Today, they had seen a step toward both. But everyone knew this was just the beginning. The lead paramedic slipped out a side door, avoiding the media crush. He had a shift starting in an hour. Emergencies don't wait for court verdicts or justice to be served. There were still lives to save, still people who needed help. That's what really mattered, not the punishment, but the reminder of why they all wore uniforms in the first place. As Wilson was led away, Officer Rodriguez watched from the gallery. There was no satisfaction in seeing his former friend face consequences, only a deep sadness for what had been lost and a determination to do better. Because in the end, this case had shown them all that wearing a badge isn't just about having power, it's about using that power to serve and protect, every minute of every day. 6 months had passed since that fateful evening at the intersection. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the police department's newly renovated training center as Chief Richardson addressed the latest class of recruits. His wife sat in the front row, her presence a powerful reminder of why they were all there. "A badge is not a shield to hide behind," the chief said, his voice carrying years of experience and hard-learned lessons. "It's a symbol of trust. Trust that must be earned every day, with every action, with every decision we make. The recruits sat straight in their chairs, absorbing his words. This wasn't just another training session. This was about changing the culture from the ground up. Across town, the lead paramedic was teaching his own class, a new joint training program between emergency services and law enforcement. Officers and medical personnel sat side by side, learning about each other's challenges, protocols, and priorities. The scowl on his lip had faded, but the lessons from that night remained clear. "We're all on the same team," he explained, pointing to a simulation on the screen. "When we work together, we save lives. When we work against each other, people suffer." The officers in the room nodded, many of them having already seen the dashcam footage from that night as part of their new training curriculum. In the dispatch center, new protocols were in place. Any tension between officers and emergency services was now immediately reported and addressed. No more looking the other way, no more hoping problems would solve themselves. The walls between departments had quite literally come down. Dispatch now handled both police and emergency medical calls in the same room, fostering better communication and understanding. Mrs. Richardson had become an unexpected advocate for change. She spoke at community meetings, sharing her story not with anger, but with hope for a better future. "What happened to me was terrible," she would say, "but if it leads to changes that save other lives, then some good can come from it." The department's new oversight committee met monthly, reviewing body camera footage, analyzing response patterns, and addressing concerns before they could escalate. Lieutenant Chen, now heading the expanded Internal Affairs Division, had implemented a system that flagged problematic behavior patterns early, before they could become ingrained habits. Officer Rodriguez led many of the new training sessions, using his experience as Wilson's former partner to help others recognize warning signs in themselves and their colleagues. "It's not about pointing fingers," he would explain. "It's about watching out for each other, keeping each other on the right path." In the hospital break room, police officers and paramedics now shared coffee and conversation between calls. The artificial barriers that had once divided them had begun to fade. They swapped stories, shared experiences, learned from each other. It wasn't always perfect, but it was progress. The lead paramedics crew had been honored for their professionalism that night, but he kept the award in a drawer. For him, the real reward was seeing the changes happening around him. Response times had improved, cooperation had increased, and most importantly, the tension that had once defined interactions with law enforcement had largely disappeared. Wilson watched these changes from afar, serving his sentence with the knowledge that his actions had sparked necessary reforms. He'd written letters to the lead paramedic, to Mrs. Richardson, to his former colleagues, taking responsibility and expressing genuine remorse. Some had written back, recognizing that his fall from grace had forced everyone to confront uncomfortable truths about power and accountability. The intersection where it all happened looked no different now, but every officer who passed through it remembered. Not with anger or shame, but with determination to do better, to be better. The lights still turned from red to green, traffic still flowed, and ambulances still raced through with sirens wailing. But now they did so without fear of interference. Community trust was rebuilding, slowly but surely. Citizens reported feeling more confident in calling for help, knowing that all emergency services would work together seamlessly. The us versus them mentality that had once divided departments was giving way to a shared sense of purpose. At the academy, new recruits now spent time riding along with paramedics and firefighters, understanding their challenges firsthand. Emergency medical personnel did the same with police patrols. Understanding grew from experience, respect from understanding. The chief's wife had fully recovered, though she would always carry the memory of that night. But like the department itself, she had emerged stronger, more determined to make a difference. Her experience had become a powerful teaching tool, a reminder of what happens when power loses its purpose. As the sun set over the city, an ambulance and a police cruiser responded to the same call, a car accident on Main Street. They arrived together, worked together, each focusing on their role but supporting the other. No tension, no power struggles, just professionals doing their jobs with mutual respect and a shared goal, serving their community. The story of that night had become more than just a cautionary tale. It had become a catalyst for real change, A reminder that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best outcomes if we're willing to learn, to grow, to remember why we chose to serve in the first place. The badge still shone, but now it reflected something better, not just authority, but responsibility, not just power, but purpose.